Hello everybody. Today I would like to introduce you to the Power Rangers action card game, or Power Rangers ACG, as it's typically abbreviated to. I play a lot of this game. It's simple, but there's enough to it to be creative and to construct some fun decks. I have been playing it for years and have kind of wanted to do this for quite some time. Decided it's finally time, New Year's starting, mix things up. I'm going to throw a few decks up on the channel. I've got like 12 or 15 or something decks built for this game, and I'm always throwing more stuff together. So I'm going to do a little series here, make a playlist of just a bunch of different decks for this game. It's very, very cheap to collect. You can still get it through Hills Wholesale Gaming. Booster boxes are anywhere between $24 and $40 depending on which set you're getting, and they are marked like half off a ton of times a year on that website. There are still starter decks you can pick up for like $3-4. It's really accessible game, and it's really simple, but there's not any content for it. It came out in 2013, and it just didn't, it existed at a time when there wasn't really coverage for stuff like that. It's uniquely, the market isn't, it is young enough that there's not a lot of like constructed competitive content for this game online. And while this isn't necessarily intended to be like competitive per se, I still wanted to post somewhere where people could look like, how do I put a deck together for this game? So I'm going to do a series of videos of these decks and just kind of show you what the game's about and how I've been playing it. My first deck, believe it or not, I'm not going to show you Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. That's everyone's go-to thing first. I'm going to show you my Time Force deck. I have a lot of fond memories of the Time Force series, and this deck is a lot of fun. Most decks, most teams do have a team card. You're not required to run these or anything, but they are typically, kind of your like top-end good card. So I always include one of these in every deck, even if it's not something that would be like particularly fitting. I always include like the team's team card. It's just so much of like playing a Power Rangers card game as opposed to being serious about it is like just playing the theme. Like, oh man, I loved Zeo, so like I want a Zeo deck, so I'm gonna of course want the Zeo team shot card or whatever. So that's kind of how I built these in mind. But getting into these, the Time Force Power Rangers team here is a 5-cost card. You pay the cost by discarding cards from your hand, and it does 3 damage if it wins the fight. Games are kind of played simultaneously, fight cards against each other. But I'll assume that if you are here to watch this deck profile, you probably know how the game is played. So I'll just kind of get right into why I have the deck built the way I do. So starting from the top, the Time Force Rangers, as a 5-cost, they do have decent stats. 3 maxes is good. And as a judgment effect, you can exchange a card in your opponent's battle area with the bottom card of their deck. Now, team cards you normally play towards the end of the game when you're trying to push for a win. It's expensive, they do a lot of damage, and having a card where you can say, oh man, in the judgment step, I'm not going to be able to beat their whatever card they have out, or I'm worried about it, or they're not a rock type card, so you're not going to deal the double damage. You can swap that card out with the bottom of their deck and try for a better choice. Now that sounds sort of like a risky gamble, but that'll make more sense as more cards kind of come together here. But that's kind of the Time Force Rangers thing, is changing time, but moving cards from the top and bottom of players' decks. So I'll get this out of the way here, and I'll show off first kind of what this deck is about. So we run 3 copies of the Quantum Ranger. Now this is sort of the core idea of this deck. He's a 2-cost card, deals 2 damage. When he's played, you may play a Quantosaurus Rex card from your discard area onto this card for 1 cost. So normally your Megazord cards are pretty expensive. The Quantosaurus Rex is a 4-cost card, which we'll see in a little bit. This lets you play him for 1 from your discard pile. Now, that's pretty good, and we'll get right into showing him off to go with it. We get the Quantosaurus Rex. Great stats. A single max is a little iffy, but great powerful stats otherwise. 4 cost, 3 damage normally, but the combo keeps going. In the assist step, So after you've rolled your dice to see what your number would be, you can exchange this card with a Q-Rex Megazord from your discard pile. So we run 3 copies of the Q-Rex Megazord. I run 3 of this and 2 of the Rex because you just kind of want to set this up and have it happen. So I like to make sure that the Megazord is present. So I play this a little more often. I want to see this more often, I guess. This one costs 5, so I'm not going to cast this for its actual hand cost very often, but its stats are incredible. If you win, your opponent discards a card from their hand, a card from their training area, and then they take 1 damage. That's pretty great too. Free damage is good, especially with that much damage anyway. They discard cards, just a lot of resource manipulation from your opponent. It makes things hard for them to keep going. Hopefully, this little combo of guys can seal a game out for you. But we of course have to get there. So first off, we're going to run the red Time Force Ranger, a 0-cost card. I run a single copy of him. You could definitely run more than one 0-cost guy, and realistically you probably should in most decks. This one, however, I run a little more 1-cost cards because we have so many cards we want to see in the discard pile. So when we draw into one of these, we can pitch it for regular costs. But this card, you may exchange any number of cards in your hand with the same number of cards from the top of your deck. Self-explanatory. This is kind of just a get-out-of-jail card. As you're digging through your deck trying to find your Quantum Rangers to set that combo up, this card kind of lets you dig a little bit deeper if you need to. 3 copies of the red Time Force Ranger. First 1-cost card here, 2 damage on these. This is going to be very consistent, and you'll see these played effects are pretty similar too. He's got decent stats, but when you play this card, you look at the top card of a player's deck, then you move that card to the top or bottom of that player's deck. You can use this on yourself or your opponent. You can use this to help yourself set up for getting your Q-Rexes online. You can also use it for making sure your opponent's going to lose a good card as damage if you're going to win, or move a card that you don't want them to draw and use against you later. Keeping with that same theme, we've got 2 copies of the blue Time Force Ranger. Now this one here is a lot more situational. I'd say this is probably the worst of the core Time Force Rangers, but still some use. Same effects, again, general stats, but you reveal the top card of your opponent's deck. If it's a support card, you discard it. If not, put it on the top or the bottom. So worst case scenario, you're still going to move one of their cards around. Best case scenario, you're going to hit a support card and they're going to lose it. It's going to be like a free damage. Now that's not very common. There aren't a ton of support cards, and the ones that there aren't normally ran. So this one doesn't see a ton of value, but he is here for that same reason the other one was, of moving cards around and discarding cards from your own hand. That said, we do have a couple more that are a little more important. We have the green Time Force Ranger. We've got 3 copies of him. 1 cost, 2 damage. Reveal the top card of your opponent's deck. If it's a Megazord card, discard it. If not, move it to the top or bottom. This one is a lot more versatile. There are a ton of Megazords. They are incredibly important. Then, for example, there are a lot of Megazord cards in this deck that I want to put in the discard pile. And making sure your opponent doesn't have those is huge. Seeing one of those come down on the board, facing 5 damage, 8 damage in front of your face, is really scary. So making sure that you have opportunities to make that not happen is huge. Then we've got 3 copies. Sorry, I dropped one on the floor. We've got 3 copies of the pink Time Force Ranger. 1 cost, 2 damage. Like I said, you'll see a theme there. But reveal the top card of your opponent's deck. If it's a villain card, discard that card, or move, and then if it's not, move it to the top or bottom of their deck. Villain sounds like it's probably tougher to see. Villain decks have to be villainous specific, and there's really only like a villain deck you can build. That said, the villain deck is pretty good and is also pretty iconic. Everyone wants to use Lord Zed, Rita, and like stuff like that, so it makes sense that people would want to play that. This works against every single card in that deck, but there's a lot more actual like tech use for this too. Some of the better Mighty Morphin Green Rangers are both good and evil to represent that he switched sides. In Dino Thunder, the white Dino Ranger is also good and evil. In Ninja Storm, the Crimson and what was his name? Cobalt? It's not Cobalt, but the blue evil Ninja Storm Ranger works. There's also the red Wolf Ranger from Mystic Force. There's just a bunch of Ranger cards that are very good that are also villain cards. So this hits a lot of those too. And pulling those out of decks is always good. And we've got 2 copies of the yellow Time Force Ranger. This one is another one that is a little less consistent, but 1 damage, 2 cost, or 1 cost, 2 damage, sorry. Again, just like the others. But this one you reveal the top card of your opponent's deck. If it's a Zord card, discard it, move it to the top or bottom of their deck. Now, you remember the green one was a Megazord. There is a slight difference between Megazords and just regular Zords. This one hits the Zords as well. There aren't as many decks that run individual Zords. More often than not, you're going to see that with something like Megaforce or Samurai, where they had a lot more of that. Or more importantly, you're going to see it with RPM. They have a lot of like Zord swapping kind of mechanics in that deck, and pulling the Zords out of that deck can really slow it down too. That's the end of our 1 cost like core Ranger package. I have 1 copy of the 2 cost 3 damage blue and yellow Time Force Ranger. This one is another one that's kind of a tech option. You may select and apply 1 plate effect of a 0 to 1 cost Time Force Ranger from your discard area. So it basically just gives you 1 more of all of these cards. When you play it, you're just going to pick one of these guys in the discard pile and use its effect. Pretty good. With all of these being as techy as they are, having 1 more option to kind of choose when to do that is useful. Then 1 copy of the green and pink Time Force Rangers to cost 3 damage. When it's played, you may look at the top 6 cards of a player's deck, then move them to the top or bottom in any order. That effect is really, really good. 2 maxes is really good. 2 cost is a lot, especially in a deck where we are trying to discard cards. We're going to run through our deck a little quicker than some other decks. We don't run a lot of zeros. But this is still a really powerful effect, so I still like to have one. And just like that 0 cost guy we were looking at earlier, the point is not so much to mess with your opponent with this card, it's more to help yourself if the kind of pre-set up Quantum Q-Rex package combo isn't going off the way that you were hoping it would. Just lets you dig a little further and set up for a better turn with that. Now, that's the end of the Time Force portion of the deck. I do have a couple extra Rangers in the deck to flesh out some support. Normally I try to keep the decks to the show that they're from, just to kind of keep the theme on brand, but sometimes it just makes sense to have a little bit of extra stuff in there. These are kind of all going to be the same effect, but they are the Lightspeed Rangers. Lightspeed Rescue Rangers, sorry. They all have 100, 100, 100, 100, and then a number, and they sort of switch spots. So they're just, I mean, their number is kind of techy, if anything. But 0 cost, again, which is good. 1 damage. You may exchange this with another card on your training area. So, as we talked about, all these cards are good. Essentially free damage if you get any of them to go off. Also just helps with making sure your opponent's plays are as suboptimal as possible while you try to set up your big Q-Rex combo. This card, if you win a fight, your guys are in your training, or sorry, if you lose a fight, your guys are in your training area, lets you replay one of them and get their played effects. 2 copies of the Blue Ranger. I would actually like to switch this to red, blue, and green, but I didn't have a spare green at the time when I put this deck together. I do have a green now, so I'll replace this with the green one. The Green Ranger has the exact same effect, but his 400 power is his level 3. But this one, just like the other one, you can exchange this with a card in your training area. We have 1 copy of the Yellow Ranger, same effect, 400 on the 4 side of the dice, and a Pink Ranger, same effect with the 400 on the 1 side of the dice. So this little package of cards here, they all cost 0, which is great. Like I said earlier, we don't have a ton of zeros in our core Ranger package. A lot of decks will run a lot more than that. So we have more trouble keeping cards in our deck than others do. But hopefully, with the way that we can manipulate the top and bottom of either player's deck, we have a little bit more control of what's going to happen and when. We can kind of mitigate that a little bit. This package helps us just continue to use those effects and have a little bit more zero cost fodder to go with it. That is the first, and that is the end of the first deck. They are only 30 cards. There's not a lot to talk about on them. They have like a sentence or two of text. So these videos will be pretty short compared to some of my other deck profiles. This one's a little longer because I kind of introduced it, but stick around. There are, like I said, there are a ton more decks that I want to do videos for this game, even if for nothing else than to just have a database of this saved somewhere so people can look it up and just throw decks together and play this. Not the most hyper competitive game that's ever existed, but just like Digibattle, which I focused a ton of this channel towards, there's still a ton of fun to be had. It's simple, but there is some room for sneaky tricks and just kind of setting up sequencing. As a game like this, it's one of those that kind of rewards fundamentals, so it rewards kind of good game state awareness, knowing how many cards are in your deck, how many chances you have to still draw a thing to get out of a certain situation, knowing what cost you have the potential to still draw or be able to pay. So there's just a lot that goes into something so simple, and I think that's really rewarding. Anyway, that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching. See you next time.